Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where two Barbie boys talk about Canada's Barbie world. And yeah, I don't know where I was going with that one. Anyway,
Two
my name
Barbie
is
boys
Patrick.
dropping bombs like an Oppenheimer.
Really getting in on the ground floor of that hot, relevant content right there.
Gotta bring up those SEO numbers, baby.
Welcome to the show. With me, as always, is Mackenzie. Yay!
Hi.
So, before we get into it, of course, as always, write a review, sign up on Patreon. You get extra episodes, extra stuff, all that fun content that you like to pay for if you want. You get ad-free episodes, all that jazz. I'm not going to bore you with it. You listen to enough podcasts. We don't need to repeat it.
I know the
Today,
rules, and so do you know the rules, and so do I.
there you go. What are we talking about today, Mac?
We're talking about a real wild dude, man. We're talking about a guy who just wanted to live free or die, and the government put him down.
Is that the interpretation we're going for? That's the official Historia Canadiana line.
Oh no, God no. What line we're gonna land on with this outlaw,
I mean,
this vagabond of Canadian history.
like, he is an interesting figure, don't get me wrong,
Mm,
but I wouldn't necessarily say that, like, he's a good guy. Like,
no.
as you could probably tell by the title, unless I changed it, we're talking about a character that's gone down in history as known as Bloody Jack, who's kind of referred to, broadly speaking, as Manitoba's Billy the Kid.
Do you agree with that statement?
We'll get into it at the end, but I can kind of see it. And I can see it more in the imaginary of it, less in the
Mm-hmm.
reality of who
Mm-hmm.
Billy the Kid is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Billy the Kid has become this mythical figure, but in real life was actually a dick, right? And probably a psychotic person, right? Um, and it's
I mean,
probably
it's the
the
same
same
thing
thing
with
with this
pirates.
guy. Yes,
It's the same with
although pirates
any
are actually
outlaw.
cool.
Yeah, it's the same with any outlaw figure I find is that in the mythology of it all, they'll be martyred and turned into some sort of symbol of rebellion because we don't want to face the truth, the real
Yeah,
truth that these people are not symbols of rebellion, they're symbols of anarchy. They're symbols of bloody chaos and killing.
and at the same time, and
We
actually
like
the
we want heroes so badly that we will create
but
them.
yeah, but at the same time, it's kind of funny. I like that analogy with pirates because there's actually more and more historiography that's coming out about pirates that kind of
Mm.
demonstrates that they were not just assholes, right? And that people actually joined them because they didn't want to participate in the kind of mercantile, very imperial system that the British and other European powers were setting up, and that piracy was kind of a way of getting outside of that system while still having that freedom, right? And obviously, it didn't always go down that way because dysentery and tuberculosis, and you had to steal to make money. But it was again that imaginary of what the pirates could be and what it represented. I think does hold ground vis-a-vis Bloody Jack and Billy the Kid. Um, so, quick question before we actually get into the topic. Actually, before that, if anyone wants to follow along with the literature, we're using a book of poetry by Dennis Cooley, who listeners might know as someone who I actually spoke to on this channel a few weeks ago. I released that episode, so you can check that out. But in 1984, he released a book of poetry called Bloody Jack, and we're going to be using that in the second half. So if you want to check that
Yo,
out,
let's fucking go. We're like using actual authors and getting ourselves into the literature sphere, baby. Patrick's getting that representation, sponsorship, baby.
let's go. Um, but I'm actually curious. So, in order to continue with this idea of Billy the Kid, right? Billy the Kid is very much a figure of the American Wild West, right?
Hmm.
And do you feel like that there is a so-called Canadian Wild West? Do you feel like it's fair to say that that existed, or are we just imagining that within the American context that we're just kind of extrapolating as far as anything that wasn't quote unquote civilization is the Wild West.
I
I don't know if
mean,
this question makes sense. Yeah.
no, it does. It actually, it's a very interesting question to posit simply because of how Canada has interacted with its frontier and still continues in many ways to interact with its frontier.
Right.
Even the admission that like the North is territories, not provinces, it's his own admission of the fact that we have not fully settled it. It is not
Yeah.
fully settled and integrated into the larger Canada.
Mhm.
And I think that speaks to our idea of what our Wild West would be. As as with many things in America, Canada's version is always a response.
Yeah.
Canada forces itself to have a literary canon because America does.
Or Britain.
Canada makes itself have a Hollywood Walk of Fame because America does.
No, I think that's fair. I like that idea. And I think, again, tales like that of Jack Krafchenko or Bloody Jack, as well as history books that were written by people like John Gray, um, who wrote James Gray, sorry, who wrote a book on prostitution in the West, right? Kind of go a long way to disprove this idea of a peaceful settlement that was
Mhm.
rather civilized, and does very much demonstrate that in the imaginary of Canadians, both contemporary to these moments in the 19th century and today, there are still these kind of like wild area. For better
Yeah.
or worse, that term I think applies, right? Um, so I do think it is fair to
Places
say
where
that there's
mankind has no business being and will
right,
get told just to fuck right off by the wildlife and the nature.
right, and the indigenous people,
Oh, that too.
which were considered a part of the
So
wildlife and
that well
nature,
then
like
by that case we mean Western man. I'm sorry. Places where Western man has no like the Eurocentric man has no place being.
right, yeah, and yeah. So in that case, I think it is fair to say that there is a Wild West in the as far as the imagination is concerned, but it's not quite the same. Like it
It's
doesn't.
no,
I feel. Yeah, it doesn't feel. I don't feel like
it
it
doesn't
has
hit
that
the
same impact.
imagination. It doesn't
Yeah.
like the American Wild West, much like a lot of American versions or US versions of these products, hit on the imagination just that much more.
Do you
Like
do you have an
the
idea
only the
why that
only
would be?
thing I can think of that is like hits the Canadian imagination just as hard as things like the Northwest Passage, which we talked about in our
Mhm.
last episode,
Yeah.
and the Klondike Gold
Yeah.
Rush.
Yeah. But that's actually a really good one because I feel like the reason why the Klondike Gold Rush is remembered is a similar reason why the Wild West in the States is remembered because there were
Mm.
so many more people
Yeah.
going through the American West and it became so much more dynamic because of it, right? And
Well,
for
I
all its issues, right? And I feel like it makes itself more known by the very number. Right? Whereas, yes, there were a lot of people here, but it's comparatively little, right?
and
And so
well,
you
it's also
don't
I
get
think
that kind of stampede.
I also think it's also just based on like the driving forces. People, the American Wild West, it had some government sponsorship, sure, but it was mostly driven by people. Like it was really like you will go out and build a new life. Like this is your opportunity to stake a claim on your land as much as you want to do this. Like really like quick, simple things that can be done in a strong way. Whereas Canada's frontier
Native.
expansion was heavily government sponsored, right? The last best west and things like that. Like it was there was a lot more government intervention. And I think when you have that, you can't have that imagination or that dream-like quality to it.
I think that's fair. Yeah. Um, segueing into the main topic here, had you ever heard of Krafchenko or Bloody
No,
Jack?
God no. Sorry for my language. I know some people don't like that I swear so much, but no, I had like I literally was like, who in the world is this guy?
I I was happy to do this research, but there's very little on him. Like there's a few
Yeah.
articles. There's the book by Cooley, and like a few police reports and like newspaper articles that were contemporary to him. But there's not like this wealth of books that have been
Mhm,
written by him. Funny enough, there's like a more famous book by famous writer Michael Ondaatje
mhm.
from Canada about Billy the Kid
Billy the
than
Kid.
there is about Bloody Jack, right? Who's like
Yeah, it's
the
hard to say that
Canadian
this is,
equivalent.
yeah, it's hard to say that like this is our version of Billy the Kid when that's kind of when there's so little to write about, you know?
Yeah. I mean, he's
I
Billy
mean,
the. I think that another parallel to make though is like the live fast, die hard kind of thing. Like I feel like Billy the Kid very much emblematizes that, and so does Krafchenko. Um,
mhm.
and yeah, we'll get more into the
But it's like
parallels a bit later.
it's well, I think it's more just to me, it's a statement of difference because people around the world know the name
Mm,
Billy the Kid.
yeah,
Like you have people that are living in poverty in countries in Southeast Asia who have heard the name Billy the Kid. It's wild. It's crazy how far like that has caught on to people's imagination and stretched their identities
you
from
feel
the
like
cowboy films that
yeah.
American soldiers would bring over and all that.
Do you feel like part of that is like good marketing as well? Like Billy the Kid sells better than Bloody Jack, as far as like
Oh,
as far as
100% there's some marketing
yeah.
to it. Like Billy
Mm,
the Kid can inherently become something that's a bit more of a fun kid's tale, you know?
mm,
The same way people can use the name Blackbeard
that's
without
true.
actually knowing the name of the pirate Blackbeard.
Right. It can kind of be whatever, right? You don't need to know the gruesome history of Billy the Kid
No.
in order
Well, you
to
know, like,
appreciate it.
how many people know Billy the Kid's actual name?
I don't, or at least I knew it, but I don't remember it off the top of my
I've
head.
heard it before, but I don't remember. It's William something for sure, but
William something.
yeah.
Hold on. No, not even. William is
There
actually an alias. His real name was Henry McCarty.
you go. I'm gonna see that's how little we know.
That's funny.
It's like knowing the
Okay,
name Superman, but not Clark Kent.
right. So Krafchenko himself would be born in the late 19th century in 1881, and he was actually Romanian to, I believe, Ukrainian parents in Romania. And very early in his life, he would come to Canada at the age of 7, and specifically to Manitoba, which was still considered the Wild
Oh,
West at the time.
Manitoba, eh? Oh yeah,
Oh,
for
yeah.
sure.
Hmm. And again, kind of showing that he's not a super sympathetic character. Um, Apparently, very early on, Krafchenko demonstrated that he was an aggressive child and didn't take kindly to any kind of slight against him. Um, Insofar as he would really go into towering rages, even as a boy, whenever someone like hurt him or was mean to him or even crossed him in any, which is always off to a good start when a 7-year-old fucks you up. Um, and apparently he was a good student. Like he wasn't a dumb person by any stretch, but he didn't really apply himself to school. Um, Now, I guess I should also mention this. What's
Mhm.
actually known about Krafchenko is mostly pieced together from kind of myths and legends, right? No one or very few, I don't think anyone's ever like sat down and spoken to him because he was kind of nobody and then he popped up and did crimes and then died. Like, so actually getting to know fact about his life is a bit
Mhm.
difficult sometimes. So there will be some moments in this when I just say, like, probably this isn't true, or we don't know, right? This is what's said, but eh. Um, but like many people or many immigrants to the West in the 19th century, Kravchenko would know and learn many languages. And throughout his life, he became fluent in German, Ukrainian, Russian, and English,
Mhm.
which obviously demonstrates just how much of a vibrant mix of people there were in the West at the time, right? And not only use, but the almost the necessity to speak all of these different languages to get around because you had to have contact with all these communities, right, who were
Right.
coming from Eastern Europe.
Right.
Um, Eventually, after his mother would die, and his father married a German woman, and apparently the two got along very well, right? To the point where she'll come back at the end of this story and be rather distraught by what happens to Jack.
Mhm.
Um, Apparently, even his family history is kind of filled with not necessarily the greatest of role models. His father was apparently someone who gambled and caroused around, according to certain newspaper sources that were contemporary to him. And his mother was apparently someone who stole horses and would go around disguised as a man, right, in order to steal them. When I read this, I was very, I don't want to say like suspicious of it, but it rings very much within the realm of 19th century ways of imagining that criminals are the way they are because their parents were like that, right? You're kind of always looking for a deeper meaning for a lot of these things, right? And kind of saying that it's genetic is a way that you kind of saw criminals being framed in the 19th century. So this is one of those moments where it could be true, it could very well be, but also I was like, this rings of Victorian morality right there. I don't know if you agree with me on that, but that's what I was thinking when I read about the way his father and mother were portrayed. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I
Go ahead.
definitely, yeah. It's interesting to me because if they're stealing horses, it's full of necessity, and that means that even if he learns to steal for himself, he's learning that he must steal as a necessity,
Mm,
and
that's
that's the
true. Eh? I
lesson that
didn't
he's
think of it
picking
that way.
up.
Yeah. Although
That's
his
like
father
you had,
gambling was just
well, it's risk taking. You learn risk taking there,
it's true.
and I think that's what we get when that's how we learn from the crimes of the parents.
Hmm.
And the sins of the
Yeah, I
father
guess.
becoming the sins of the son is because those are the lessons that he learned. So now when we see him and he's thieving, this is what he's going to start, and we wonder why he couldn't turn to a different life. It's because that was the life he learned.
Yeah. I
Like
can
we,
yeah.
there's not really a public education at that point, so the only lessons he's learning come from his family.
Yeah, it was just starting off, if I remember correctly, or at least to solidify itself, public education. Yeah. Um, and it also goes to show just how much of the Wild West existed in this time, right? Where it's just like, yeah, you can kind of do whatever to get by, or you kind of had to do whatever to get by at times.
Right.
And sometimes community wasn't enough. So apparently his stepmother did impose quite a strict upbringing, right, after his mother had died. But nevertheless, he would start getting into trouble. And according to an 1892 edition of the Winnipeg Daily Tribune, Krafchenko's name is mentioned. And at the time, he would have been an 11-year-old. And he was charged with stealing 5 watches. And he told the newspaper that I thought they would fall off, and he was only keeping them till he had a chance to actually return them to the
Mm-hmm.
rightful owner, obviously. Um, which classic excuse. Yeah, I was just holding on to them for a friend. That's
It's not no big deal.
yeah, that's what I told my mom the first time I got caught with weed. Um,
Just it's a friend's weed,
yeah, obviously. Pay no
obviously.
attention to the smell. um, but you know, as would have been common for children at the time, he got off with kind of a slap on the wrist and a warning, right? He was caught at the very least and he gave back the watches. He showed remorse. Okay, go on your merry way. Later, when he was 15, so this would have been in 1896, he was caught stealing a bike in the nearby town of Morden. And again, this is where the record gets kind of sketchy. He might have been sent to jail, but it's not sure at all. There's not enough records that remain of this. He might have, but we really don't know.
Which would help with his story, honestly, because then you can fill in the blanks yourself.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
The more
That
blank spots in the story there is, the better it will usually do.
and that's where we'll get in with Dennis Cooley after. I think that's why he was able to craft such an interesting piece is because he fills it in with poetry. Um, Regardless of whether he went to jail, this did start off a career of crime, right? And from this age, he would basically be in some kind of criminal endeavor for most of his life. And this is
Let's
something
go
that would take him
crime.
a
Let's go.
life of crime. What?
Oh,
Um,
baby.
and this life would take him across to America, across Canada, and even into Europe. So it would span about 2 continents. Um, and in the early 1900s, and this is another one that I think your point of filling in the blanks is a very good one because
Mhm.
Apparently, so he would have been in his early 20s at this point. This is where, according to legend, he started off in a career of boxing, where some accounts say wrestling. Um, and some people say it was in Canada, and some people say that he was boxing in Australia, right? Regardless, there was kind of this myth of him as a brawler that was forming. Um, but probably this wasn't true, just because there's literally not a single mark on his face by the time he's arrested for the final time. Like he
Mhm.
has none of the signs of having pursued any kind of boxing career, right? So probably this was just some kind of legend or story that was started to make people fear him, which I think is really cool. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but I think that's dope. Just say like,
That he's a
yeah, I'm a
boxer.
boxer. Don't fuck with me.
I mean, it almost makes you think that might have been his own legend, like he was building his own lies.
Really like to think
Like
that. And
it's
it would
one
have
thing
been
to say
so
you're
easy at the
Bloody
time.
Jack, but if you can say you're also Conor McGregor, then that's a lot more terrifying.
Like, I don't have to kill you, but I can pound you into the ground. And
Yeah.
that's even more terrifying. Like, um,
Hmm.
but it does apparently, and this is true um, of him, where he was someone who did actually have an imposing figure. And I don't mean necessarily that he was the tallest or strongest, but he was well built and he was intense, right? And so that part
Yeah,
does
there's a
fit
way
in with,
that people can carry themselves that no matter how big they actually are, they're going to be more intimidating than me or Patrick.
yeah. Oh, but yeah, for sure, me. I'm an ant is more intimidating than I am to be. Um, but this also, I think I'm going to bring it back when we talk about Cooley, because this idea that he can kind of craft his own stories and build up his own character is something that I think the poetry of Bloody Jack plays off of.
Hmm.
Yeah, which we'll come back to. For the time being, within his own life, this idea of him being some kind of fearsome person, right, that you had to listen to, would actually translate briefly into some time in something that's not crime related, but was
Hmm.
actually part of the normal end of the Victorian morality period of the time, and that is a temperance speaker, because that was starting off in the early 20th century, right? You
God,
got to stop the alcohol, right? um, which
Lord,
again
have
is
mercy.
it's
Never
the
mind that the
alcohol.
blood of Christ is wine.
It's a metaphor, Mac. It's not actually wine. Come on, know your catechism. But yeah, it again. This is one that really hammers home this idea of Jack as this walking contradiction. Whereas, like, because if you looked at the rhetoric behind the temperance movement, it was very much like, oh, you can't get on the drink unless because it's going to stop you from working an honest day's pay, and it's going to lead you to a life of crime, and you're going to be
Hmm.
immoral because of it. And it's like, motherfucker, your whole life is a crime. Like, what grounds do you have to stand on to be a temperance speaker in this kind of field? But hey, whatever. um, but again, getting back to this, like, part of his power as a temperance speaker was not only his stature, but to bring it back to a previous point, the fact that he would be able to speak so many languages. So he could actually address different people. And in the criminal underworld that he was increasingly operating in, he could threaten people in Russian, right? Just as easily as he could threaten them in German, which is
Hmm.
terrifying,
Yeah.
right? If someone can tell me insults in four languages, I know that he means business, or she.
Well, we say that, but it
Like,
was actually like it was a long-standing thing that's what you had to do when you were living in places like Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Like there's a
right.
lot of stories of people growing up like learning four, five, six languages simply because if you fucking didn't, you couldn't ask your neighbor for for a spoonful of sugar.
I mean, that makes sense. Yeah.
And that's what led the guy who made Esperanto to make Esperanto.
I thought that was World War One.
Oh, it was a
Wasn't,
it was a similar situation.
yeah.
Like he grew up in a neighborhood of like having to learn six languages for communication. He saw all the trouble that was causing, and he was like, you know what?
Right.
Universal language, baby.
And now, like, two people speak Esperanto, so that's great.
I mean, it was
Have you
almost
ever actually?
the spoken language of the UN.
Was it really? Did it get that far?
Yeah, yeah. For a while, Esperanto was a huge movement. But going back to
Cool.
Bloody Jack, it was
Yeah.
there's so again fueled by necessity. He has this skill now.
Hmm.
He has this lesson that he's learned that we think is just kind of cool. But for him, it's just like we have to remember this is just him doing what he has to do. Like what he perceives as what must be done is learning four languages and threatening you in all of them.
Yeah, I think keyword here is he perceives he has to do because we'll get to it a bit
Yeah.
later.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't necessarily have to. He's again not dumb. He's perfectly able to
No.
do other things. He just doesn't. Right? Um, and part of that might be the temper, but we'll get to that. But regardless of his brief time as a temperance speaker, he would nevertheless come into
Mm-hmm.
contact with the local authorities as he would be increasingly known for more and more criminal activities. And what finally got him in is something similar that would get in a lot of criminals, including none other than Al Capone, was that he passed bad checks. So basically, he was committing fraud.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's one thing we know about North America is that you have to get caught if you're fucking over the monetary system, right? Like it got Al Capone and it got Krafchenko in this case. And according to one particular source, the way they framed it was he passed numerous bad checks throughout Manitoba and was finally caught in Regina, where he was sentenced to 18 months in Prince Albert Penitentiary.
And people in Regina, they don't mess around.
No. And it depends. I don't know how old he would have been. I didn't write down the date of when this was. So Regina might have been already a province. Saskatchewan might
Mm-hmm.
have been a province at the. Yes, actually, it would have been a province at the point. So yeah, yeah, they would have had their own laws. So yeah, they don't fuck around, indeed. Um, this is where a bit of the myth making also plays a part, right? Because this next part comes from James Gray, the same person I mentioned earlier, who, for those of you who don't know, was a well-known journalist and historian or popular historian from the prairies, right? Who did a lot of work to, popularize a lot of prairie history. And in his biography, or in his autobiography, I should say, which is an account of his boyhood in Winnipeg, he talks, he dedicates a whole chapter to Krafchenko and the image of Krafchenko that he had as a boy growing up in Winnipeg,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting. By the way, I do recommend people check it out. It's on archive.org. Get it for free. But in that particular source, Gray mentions that en route to Prince Albert Penitentiary, Krafchenko apparently jumped through the window of a moving train while handcuffed in order to escape, which is metal in any occasion. That's really dope. But what's even funnier is that apparently the guard, not fearing for his life at all, also jumped out the window after him in order to capture him, which I'm
Oh,
sure
fun.
Krafchenko was not expecting at all. Like, I
Krafchenko was like, I'm gonna do something crazy. The guard, not just you, pal.
hold my beer.
Yeah.
Like, good
Hold my
on you,
beer. No, you
Krafchenko.
hold mine.
Right. So whether this was true or not has yet to be determined. Gray is the only one who mentions this,
Mm-hmm.
which again I think kind of points to the myth making behind Bloody Jack, because as a boy, James Gray would have been enamored by this type of heroics, right? Regardless of whether or not Krafchenko was a good person, it's kind of metal to jump out of a moving train, right?
Mm-hmm.
No matter who you are. So, I think this kind of building up of a Billy the Kid type of figure definitely would have appealed to a young boy on the prairies where nothing else happens, right? But jumping out of a train, that's cool. Um, During his time at Prince Albert, Kravchenko was asked, or not asked, he was made to paint the walls, right? But specifically the outer wall, which was a bad idea because he used a paint can to escape after he struck a guard on the head with it, right? So he basically killed a man with a paint can and he escaped with three other people. I don't know if the guy actually died, but I can imagine that he had a hell of a headache at the very least with a paint can to the head. But Krafchenko is actually the only one who succeeded to escape. The other three were recaptured, and he would make it back to Manitoba, where he immediately held up a shipment of money and fled to the United States.
God,
So,
love it.
like, the balls on this guy who's just like, I committed
Hmm.
fraud. I got into prison, jumped out a train, killed a man with a paint can, maybe. I'm gonna like steal some money.
What if I just keep doing crazy shit? What's
And
what's gonna happen? I'm gonna die? Oh no.
oh no, I certainly don't have a death wish. um, but he stole about $2,500 at the time, which I don't know what that translates to in today's money. I would imagine it's something like 5,000, probably something like that, five or
Well,
six
how much was
thousand
it?
dollars in today's money.
250?
2,500,
2,500?
2,500,
And what year was
about
this?
120 years ago,
Yeah, so that probably
1905.
be probably translates into 20, 25 grand.
Well, you think that much? Wow. Okay.
I'm trying to do the
I
math
guess.
on it, but yeah, it would have been well because later you say something like he had a bounty of 1 grand, but in today's money it was $25,000, right?
Right. That's true.
And so if it's 2,500, I'm guessing almost double that if you want to go, or maybe around 50 grand.
Right. Well, this is in American dollars. Damn. I was like, oh, $1 in 1905 is worth $35 today, but that's an American. But still, it gives you
Oh,
a sense. Right.
yeah, like this is
Um,
it was not inconsiderate amount of money.
no, exactly. So he stole a bunch of cash, basically, and he left to the States. Um, and apparently unsatisfied with the boatload of cash that he just bought, because apparently $2,500 at the time wasn't enough, even though he could probably put a down payment on like 3 houses with that. I don't know. He went basically on a robbing spree throughout the United States, went to the United Kingdom, Germany, and Italy, where he held up even more banks. So this motherfucker is not even just the Billy the Kid of Canada. He's the Wild West guy of Germany and Italy, and he's the British Billy the Kid. He's whatever you want him to be. Um, so that's kind of cool, I guess. I don't know what to say. It's like he just basically went on a robbing spree. Um,
I think it speaks
and
to just
yeah, go ahead.
how his perception again. Like, because
Mm,
you and me, we think, oh, you've basically been given a second chance to do things differently. But he just can't perceive that kind of notion. He can't perceive that ability to do things differently. There's no
which apparently,
rehabilitation for a guy like him. There's no way to teach him a different way.
and apparently that's not something that's uncommon with
Hmm.
career criminals. It's just like they don't. Apparently, it's just like, well, what else am I going to, right?
Hmm.
It's and it's
What
it's
other
it is
skills do
that
they
vicious
have?
cycle. But it's not just that. It's like it's a vicious cycle of like, well, now that I have that cash, but I have to maintain a
Hmm.
life, right? So I can't go get a job because I have a criminal record. So I guess I'll steal more money, right?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, even if he
The
did have
system
other
is what brings
abilities,
them down.
right? Like it is rigged against you in a sense, for this particular thing, right? And you see this till to this day, right? People with criminal records have a much higher uh, difficulty rate of getting a stable job, right? Which often leads them
Mm.
down again more crime. Um, so in 1906, he and his new wife Fanica would return briefly to Canada to settle where he had initially settled with his parents, which is called Plum or Cooley, I guess. Um, where he soon robbed another bank, this time near Winkler, Manitoba, the Bank of Hamilton. And then he kind of disappears for a year. There's not much that's said in the sources about him for 1906, 1907. He just kind of robs this bank and leaves.
Hmm.
But he shows back up in Winnipeg. And this is kind of where it gets interesting, as far as the goings back and forth between him and the police. Because in 1908, the Winnipeg Free Press announces that, quote, tired of being hounded by police officers for a crime of which he declares his innocence, but admitting guilt on minor charges, John Krafchenko, alias Pearl Smith, which is a dope alias,
Yeah.
was arrested Monday night. Though reckless of his life, he was captured so quickly that he had no chance to use the automatic revolvers with which he was armed to the teeth. Apparently, he was full of guns, like the freaking Joker. And but the police caught him, so he just stopped. But what's interesting is that he wasn't arrested for that particular crime of the Bank of Hamilton that I just mentioned. He was arrested because he was also there with another criminal, Thomas Henry Hicks, who was being tried for the murder of Eccles Lennox in a sleeping car on the CP railways. So, by association with this accused murderer, that's where Krafchenko was taken in. Right? Now, he was brought in to the trial of Hicks in this case, where he, quote, stated that the gun was actually his that was used for the crime, but that he wasn't the murderer. And from there, the actual case kind of unraveled and Hicks was let off, and Krafchenko was not actually charged with that particular murder. Right? But as soon as he left the courthouse, Krafchenko was arrested for the Bank of Hamilton robbery. So they kind of had him on two accounts in this case. And during that new trial that Krafchenko was a part of, he was sentenced to 3 years of prison, which he did in full, apparently. And it's after his release that his wife and himself moved to Ontario, where for the first time, he actually had a job, right? So good on you, Krafchenko. 3 years of jail will do that to you, I guess.
But let's see how long that job lasts.
How long do you think it lasts?
Oh, a couple months maybe.
No, that's generous. It did last a few years,
Okay.
but I think only because HR wasn't a thing at the time.
Yeah.
Because he was a blacksmith in Ontario and he was eventually a foreman for the National Transcontinental Railway. So he actually got pretty high up as far as echelons are concerned.
Well, there you go. He's working on the railway, another thing that steals money.
He fit right in with the other robber barons. He should have also worked for an oil company, although
Or
that
Jeff
wasn't quite the
Bezos.
time.
He
So
can tweet it out on
took
X.
a few years. Sorry, go ahead.
He can tweet it out on X.
X is one of those things that no one's ever going to call it that. No, like, I don't care who you think you are. It's always going to be Twitter. It's weird.
But now they're called
X.
Well, now we tweet out X's.
No, you tweet.
No, we send out our X's.
God. So again, I think because HR wasn't a thing, he would actually manage to stay a few years in a relatively stable job. But because of his violent outbursts that got apparently too intense, he was fired and nobody wanted to hear from him. And that's when he returned to a life of crime. Okay, folks, let's talk about productivity. The number one question I get is, how do you do it? You have a job, you have a successful podcast, you're a PhD student. Well, granted, it's in English, but still, I'm a PhD student. Anyway, what's your secret? Well, it used to be coffee and good old gumption, but let me introduce you to this new product, Magic Mind. Instead of reaching for a second cup of coffee to keep my energy levels up, now I just take this little shot every morning alongside my first cup, and I'm good to go for the rest of the day. It's made with a bunch of natural products like matcha and lion's mane mushrooms, and I found that my concentration and energy have been maintained without any increase to my stress levels. I've actually shared Magic Mind with my partner, who's been going through similar experiences as I have, and I've never seen her so focused. Folks, it's incredible. If you're like me or just feel like you need a boost in any part of your life, go check out magicmind.com/Canadiana and join a community of go-getters. You can also use my discount code Canadiana20 to get up to 56% off your first subscription or 20% off your first one-time purchase. My 56% off code only lasts 10 days, so hurry up. Check out magicmind.com/Canadiana. what would ultimately lead to his downfall, or at least, yeah, I guess you could say that his downfall was the murder of Henry Medley Arnold, who was the manager of the Bank of Montreal in Plum Cooley. Not the head of Bank of Montreal. That would have been a much bigger story
Mhm.
in this case, but the manager of a Bank of Montreal. So this guy was killed during the robbery, and Krafchenko was the main suspect. And the reason why this was A, because of eyewitness accounts that claimed that they might have seen someone similar to Krafchenko in the area at the time, but also because that was a plan that Krafchenko had hatched with some associates, but the associates didn't go through with it. Right? They had to leave for a variety of reasons. That kind of group plan fell apart. So there was a background to Krafchenko robbing a Bank of Montreal, but yeah, for a variety of reasons, it didn't quite go as planned. But while there wasn't definitive proof, Krafchenko was the main suspect, and because of that, uh, this led to one of the biggest manhunts in Manitoba's history, and certainly at the time, right? Where $1,000 reward, which is about $25,000 today, as you mentioned earlier, was offered for Krefchenko. Madness.
I think it's just kind of we've been going over his life, and it's almost fascinating how much it is the thing of legends, and it would be the tale of movies, but it has not become that yet. Like it
Right.
isn't it doesn't capture. There's just it's missing the X factor.
Mm. Apparently, a few years ago, there was a theater play made of it,
Oh,
which
I'm
I
sure
want to
there's
see
been
that.
a couple attempted adaptations, but there's still like it's
Mhm.
missing something else to
Yeah.
really get it
Yeah.
going.
I think it lacks a sympathetic character.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
he's
Like because
not a guy that I'd be like, yeah, him. He was a dick from the start.
well, because we learned about Billy the Kid, we learned that he was almost not mean. He was just psychotic, if that makes sense.
He was not well in his.
Yeah. This guy
I
has
mean,
full control of his faculties.
I don't like. Again, we don't know because I don't think there was ever like a psychological analysis of him. But like, who has violent outbursts like that? Like, it might not have been entirely normal as well,
Right.
right? Um, but I don't know.
But yeah, it's I don't know. It's just
Um,
it's missing that X factor to make it a truly interesting, worthwhile
mm,
tale worth telling.
right. We'll come back to that. Um, so again, proving that the biggest manhunts are when a banker dies. Manitoba sets out on this, or Manitoba's police sets out on hunting for Krafchenko. Through through machinations, he would eventually pop back up in Winnipeg under a fake identity, and he would board there for a bit. Um, some of the loot that he had managed to steal over the past few days, and presumably during the robbery of the Bank of Montreal as well, was hidden with some associates and around town. And he was apparently able to send about $700 to his wife. So not an unseemly sum again. So about
Hmm.
$20,000 more or less. Um, and he was planning to escape from the city dressed as a woman. Like that was his proof plan, was just cross dress and escape. Which, if you've seen a picture of Jack Krivchenko, he does not have the fair features of a woman. We'll put it that way. You can look it up on Google, listeners. Um, but yeah, doesn't exactly ring the woman.
Hmm.
Um, so not long after, however, the police would find him and they would send about 20 men to the room that he was boarding at. And this would have been at the end of 1913 on December 10th. So on that night, Krefchenko was actually waiting for an associate. The police just tapped lightly on the door. It wasn't anything extreme. Krafchenko
Hmm.
didn't think much of it, and he answered the door, and immediately, apparently, his face went white as a ghost as 20 guns pointed right at him and took him to the precinct. Because of course you would. That many barrels leveled at you, you're not gonna try to run. So ultimately, the police would find thousands of dollars hidden in the room
Hmm.
and nearby. Right. So just goes to show just how successful he was as a criminal. And Kravchenko's trial um, would actually happen in early January.
Mhm.
However, he did escape from jail while awaiting trial. Um, so basically, what he did, just for a brief parentheses here on his escape, he basically managed to convince a guard and his own lawyer with tales of riches, right, that he had
Mhm.
accumulated over time to help him plan a jailbreak. It went a bit wrong, right? One of them was supposed to arrive with a getaway car, but got drunk. I think it was his lawyer who got drunk and forgot to show up, basically, right? But Krafchenko still managed to escape from jail with a clothesline, um, spraining his knee and an ankle in the process, but still escaping. And he managed to stay about a week outside of prison, trying to plan his escape. But he was found again, and so were his associates.
Mhm.
So again, kind of a legendary thing to do, just escaping from jail constantly, always just outside of the grasp of the law. Like, to come back to your point, you can see the elements of a kind of rascal but lovable figure, right?
Right.
If he were a more appreciable figure, it would be kind of cool, but he's just not. um, so yeah, I don't know if it was just to come back to what you were saying earlier, basically.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
this time, when they caught him, they were making sure that he would never have a chance to escape, and they basically locked him in a steel cage used for condemned criminals. Right? He was still
Mhm.
awaiting trial, and he would get trial, but they were like, "We're not taking any chances. This guy escaped jail like 5 times. You're going, you're going in a steel box, my dude." Um, and he was tried in Morden before a jury, like it was all due process, and about 70 people would witness against him in the trial. And the courtroom was apparently packed throughout the entire process, which lasted a few weeks. Right? People were very interested in this tale
Oh,
of
sure.
Krafchenko. Again, biggest manhunt in Manitoba at the time. Um, some actually would send supportive letters to him, um, thinking that he was innocent. And Krafchenko would actually claimed this, right? He always claimed his innocence in that particular bank robbery, the Bank of Montreal one, until the end, right? He never claimed that he was guilty of that one. Um, and apparently, there was even a petition that contained 10,000 names, although some estimates go as high as 20,000
Mhm.
for clemency, which wild, right? Um, you so rarely see that in as far as like robbery cases go. But I feel like, again, fitting in with this image of the Wild West, people were just like, yeah, fuck the banker. I don't care.
Fuck the
He has enough
banker.
money. And ultimately, that didn't solve anything. The evidence was absolutely stacked against Krafchenko's case, and he was convicted of the murder and robbery, which led to the only way that he could be sentenced at the time, which was execution by hanging, which happened in July of 1914. So again, all in all, he would have been how old would he have been? He would have been 30, about, right? 32,
Mhm.
32 or 33 at the time. So not that old as far as, uh, well, anyone is concerned, even in the 20th, early 20th century. And he had gone through quite a bit, right, as a person.
Yeah.
And before he was hanged, apparently newspapers at the time, which again, we don't know if this is true or not, but presumably reported that his dying wish was that his son be raised Christian, and that he apparently expressed the most intense sorrow and like disappointment for the pain that he had caused to others. Right? So he apparently did show remorse, um, but ultimately it meant nothing, and he was hung or hanged,
Mhm.
I should say. Apparently, 2,000 people showed up to his hanging, which again was probably the entire village. And to come back to his stepmother and to show just how much she and him had a quite a caring relationship, apparently as soon as it was possible for her to do so, she brought his body down and tried to revive him. which is very dark when you think about it, but again, shows just how much that relationship existed. And she did everything that she could. CPR. She actually brought witches and warlocks, apparently, according to some newspaper sources of the time, and even a voodoo practitioner.
My
How much of
God,
this is true, I don't know. Um, People tend to be sensationalist in newspaper accounts, but
that's still funny if any of it is
regardless,
true.
that's dope. Like, you bring a witch and a warlock to try to resuscitate a dude. That's hella nice. um, but yeah, nothing obviously happened, and he would be eventually buried in an unmarked grave in what's today's Winnipeg's Brookside Cemetery, which I
Mm,
think you can still, I think it's still there, right? You can find it.
yeah.
So again, live fast, die hard. That was Bloody Jack. Anything you want to add before we get into a bit of the poetry?
Again, we have this story of warlocks and voodoo and wishes and everything else, but we still don't have Bloody Jack's mythology. Like he's still not that kind of figure.
Yeah, like I
He
feel that
just
there's
doesn't cut
room
it.
there. Yeah. What would you add? Would it is it simply a sympathetic character, or would you maybe create like a greater story arc, like a beginning, middle, and end? Because I feel like that's also missing. Like there's no clear beginning, middle, and end that makes it a compelling. He just starts off and dies after a
I
string
just
of murders.
I don't know. I don't know what's missing. It's just it's missing something.
Mm, okay. Well,
Maybe
Bloody
reasoning.
Jack, maybe. Yeah. Aside from just necessity or
Yeah.
felt necessity. Well, that's what I think is interesting about Bloody Jack as a piece of writing is that it kind of fills in some of these blanks with the poetry, right? So, as you mentioned before, actually, I'll let you say it. Like, how is this whole book structured, right? As a piece, because it's not just poetry.
Hmm. Oh,
I
sorry.
asked you a
Sorry.
question.
Oh, sorry. Repeat the
No, no,
question.
no. I was just gonna say, like, do you want to actually tell the people like how it's structured? Because you mentioned that before we started
Yeah,
recording. Like, what's it like?
it
Because it's
it
not just
it
poetry.
no, it's poetry interspersed with prose, interspersed with almost factual accounts. It's very different style of book. But almost
Yeah.
I think something that's popped up before for that time.
Yeah, so this came out in the mid 80s originally. So
Hmm.
it was, yeah, this kind of experimentation with the forms
It's very
had certainly happened
postmodern.
before. Oh yeah. Yeah. But I mean you see it as far back as fucking Finnegan's Wake, right? With James
Hmm.
Joyce, right? He's like just kind of playing with forms and doing whatever with the text. But I think it works really well here because there's still that through line of Bloody Jack, right?
Hmm.
Um, and before we get too deeply into the poetry, I actually wanted to read one of the excerpts at the start of the text that I think introduces what Dennis Cooley's intentions with the book are really well, right? And this is a quote from a French literary theorist and philosopher called Roland Barthes, who was popular in the 50s and 60s, very much within that post structuralist kind of mode that you're talking about, where he writes, or the quote says, there have not been here only writers hungering for reality, and brilliant narrators whose dazzling verve carries off a man's head. Whatever the degree of guilt of the accused, there was also the spectacle of a terror which threatens us all, that of being judged by a power which wants to hear only the language it lends us. We
Hmm.
are all potential diminuti, not as murderers, but as accused, deprived of language, or worse, rigged out in that of our accusers, humiliated and condemned by it. To rob a man of his language in the very name of language, this is the first step of all legal murders. I really like this. Baft
Yeah.
is not always the most approachable type of thinker, um, but yeah, just this idea of the idea of a legal murder, right? To rob a man of his language is in the very name of language is, I think,
Hmm.
very much informative of this text of giving back a voice and trying to ascribe a kind of text to this very eclectic figure, right?
Hmm.
That is hard to pin down. And I think the text as a book reflects this, right? not only in the way that you're talking about, insofar as like it's poetry and prose and fact and fiction mixed together, but also just the poetry itself doesn't follow a conventional form.
Mhm.
Some of them do, but as you get deeper and deeper into the book, it's just like there's these onomatopoeias and words are broken up and the form switches constantly from one to the other, and it just really kind of emphasizes this eclectic person.
Yeah,
Um,
and the form of
yeah,
the
go
book,
ahead.
I think, carries forward this idea that what we know about Jack comes from so many different sources.
Yes. Okay, that's really good. Do you want to say more about that?
Well, it's more like because yeah, a lot of this was his, like the author wrote all this himself, but the fact having it almost this idea that it's coming from so many different sources and pretending that way sort of builds on this idea that nobody really knew Bloody Jack. Nobody can really prescribe anything to know him.
Yeah.
Same way with how some of the poems themselves are structured. The words are all over the page. So form
Absolutely.
is now playing into the narrative, as it were.
Yeah. And yeah, I kind of jumping off of that because I'm sure you have particular passages that you want to talk about. If I don't know if you had particular poems that you selected that you wanted to share, but kind of jumping off of that, the I the way in which the poetry kind of parallels the violence specifically of Jack's life is what really
Mm-hmm.
stuck out to me, right? And to give readers an example, the book, it doesn't open with that because there's one poem called Dear Valentine first, but the second poem literally opens with Jack dying. Like it's his death where he gets hung. So you
Mm-hmm.
immediately get the sense of not only death in the most general sense and violence, but also personal violence that's ascribed to Jack specifically, both by outside forces and the way that he perceives his own violent death, right? Because death by hanging is an inherently violent one. And just to give a few passages, because it's a long poem, so I'm not going to read all of it, but just to give a couple lines here. The new wood sweet and wet, so it softens sound. A priest beside him so low and fast we cannot tell. Not a word, Krafchenko, between the posts in front of him, straight at the rope. So obviously he's just about to get the noose around his neck. But again, coming back to the Roland Barthes quote that I just mentioned earlier, right? One of the violences that's being imposed onto him is that he cannot speak. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Krafchenko is having the words literally removed from his mouth, which forces people like sources afterward, as well as Dennis Cooley, to give him a voice, which can arguably be a form of violence depending on how you want to frame this particular character, right? Either as sympathetic or as a degenerate, for example, right? Who just
Mm-hmm.
kills for the fun of it. Um, yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add about that particular
Passage.
point, but
No, I think it all. I think it sums itself up pretty well. I don't know how
no,
much
it's fine.
there's to add with this book, Bloody Jack, Coolidge, and everything else. I think it is an interesting read as you go through, seeing these
Mm,
rampant pieces almost sort of plucked from the leaves.
yeah, that's I do think as well, one of the things that's kind of cool, and this is later in the text, this is on page 73, right? Kind of
Mm-hmm.
points to why the text is, or why Jack, I should say, is seemingly interesting, right, as a figure, is again because um, I'm just trying to find the passage here. Yeah, is
Mm-hmm.
because Cooley reframes him as a kind of hero, right? Not just in the violent sense of him having violence imposed onto him, but very much imposed, sorry, as a working class hero, right? In each case, those who abetted Kraft seemed simply to have been mesmerized by the bandit and to have fallen under the spell of his charm. He was simply fascinating, right? So, very much pointing to the charisma that you were mentioning before. But also, this I think parallels quite nicely um, to an earlier point in the text on page 16, which is part of the text. They're going to make a big star out of me. where it says, starting from his small town origins and his first taste of injustice and adventure, when he runs away after setting fire to the woodshed at the local school, he moves in a flurry of activity in many countries, and until and even after he is arrested for holding up the bank in his hometown of Cooley and for allegedly killing the bank manager in the getaway, the papers and workplaces are full of reports centering on the crime, the trial, Krafchenko's past, his escape, his romances, and his execution. Right?
Mm-hmm.
But I like that section at the beginning, his first taste of injustice and his small town origins. Um, and then by the end, Cooley saying, like, but that's not what people are focusing on. They focus on
No.
the sensational aspect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is interesting, right? We just talked for an hour about it,
But it
but
doesn't leave a
it's not.
lasting story.
Mhm.
It doesn't
But
leave a
I
long
think
lasting
that's
impression.
right. But I think when you were talking about like something that's missing, I think that's something that is missing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, give him an origin. Why is he like, right? Starting from his small town origins and his first taste of injustice and adventure. Already, just that kind of makes him much more interesting as like someone who's like not just doing this for the fuck of it, but just like, oh no, I've seen some horrible stuff done in small town Manitoba that's made me mad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to rebel against the system. Whether that's historically accurate or not, Cooley doesn't care because that's not the point of poetry in this case. It's not meant to be historically accurate. It's meant to build this character into something that you want to read poetry about. Yeah, I don't know if you agree with me that that makes him more interesting, but I just wanted to go off of what you had just said before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, okay, the last thing I want to mention here, um, yeah, again, this kind of relates to violence, but I don't know how far you got in the text, but did you notice that there's a lot of ways in which violence and sex are kind of related in the text, or violence and erotics, I should say. It's not necessarily sex, but erotics
Mm-hmm.
and eroticism. Did you notice that?
Well, yeah, that's always gonna. Violence and sex will always be together to sell.
Right, right.
That's
That's kind of cool. But did you notice how that played out in the poetry?
no. Tell me how it plays out in the poetry.
Okay.
Talk poetry to me.
Always. So hold on. Where to? It's on. Yeah. So, just with the title of this particular poem, and this is on page 94, "Cunning Linguist," right? Which, you know,
Mm-hmm.
is obviously a play on words. Um, but uh, there you go. On page 95, it continues here. I had a particular section that I thought was cruel. Yeah. Perfectly cunning lingual will bring you all, sing you all aphorisms and idiom, a dictionary of catchphrases. Psst, all the catchword catch as catch can before you kick the can snatches of talk of snatches, especially for the amusement of all you stiff-necked, tight-lipped, sharp-tongued, law-abiding, close-mouthed white folks and face the muse sick, only pay lip service, taken a dim view of thumbing your nose not up to what's smack dab in front of you, not at all in good taste bound to prick up a few ears, raise a few eyebrows, you highbrows. Yeah, so that might sound like a stroke for someone listening to say it out loud. But do you see what I mean though? It starts
Yeah, for
off
sure.
with with players on words, right? On cunnilingus. And
Well, I remember reading
obviously,
one of it, and it was like it had abbreviated couldn't to cunt.
right, right. Do you remember what section that is? Just out of
Oh, it's very
curiosity.
early.
Right, very early. Right, but it very much works into that. So I don't think he's excusing Jack, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think he's still very much framing him as someone who is a terrible person ultimately, right? He kind of mistreats people, but also associates violence with something very erotic. He gets a kick out of it, right? Which is never good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the same time, no, I can't find it. Okay, I can't find the passage you're talking about. But right at the same time, there's also right a kind of animalizing that's happening of
Hmm.
both Bloody Jack and the women that he's talking about, right? Later, not far from that passage that I just read, right on page 100, where he's again this violence appears where he says, "Here, pussy, pussy, come on, come on, Kessa, oh what a pretty pussy, yes you are so pretty, sure, sure you are, yes, such a pretty pussy, so pretty," which just is horrible to read, right? You just like you feel icky reading something like that, to put it in those terms, right? It's just a disgusting passage, but very
Hmm.
much points to this kind of overt way that violence is made less of, right? Through these linguistic turns of
Hmm.
phrase and through the sexualization. Um, yeah, I don't know. These are just all ideas that I had about this text. I know you didn't read it as much as perhaps the
We're not
last
as
text
in
that we
depth.
read. Yeah, but these are just ideas that I had about it. I don't know if you wanted to pick up on any of your just like, yep, this is cool.
I think I think it plays into the sensationalism, and so in that own way,
Mm,
Cooley is admitting of itself. There's not a lot to the story besides the sensationalism of it all. We can't turn
right.
the story into the myth that we want it to be because there isn't a myth there to take. So
Oh,
might as
that's
well
kind
lean
of
into
interesting.
the sex and the drugs and the violence.
Yeah, and the
Because
text.
there's like we've gone through his story and there's no real story to tell. Like, yeah, he
Right.
did all these cool things, but he was an outlaw. He was one of dozens. Like if you're gonna be an outlaw, you gotta have something special, a gimmick or something else, you know?
So what was Billy the Kid's gimmick?
He was Billy the Kid. It's in the name.
Bloody Jack's a cool gimmicky name.
Bloody Jack is there's been 1,000 Bloody Jacks at this point throughout history.
That's true. It would have been not that long ago that there was like the other Bloody Jack the Ripper.
Yeah. And there's no
Right.
way some Canadian schmuck who robbed banks is ever gonna stand toe to toe with Jack the Ripper.
That is true. But yeah, but I do kind of appreciate still what Cooley's doing, both as a poet. I do think he's a
Hmm.
very good poet, but I do like that where the poetry itself, as as wordplay, reflects his life. Because I think you're right. There's not much there per se, but the poetry kind of excessively represents this, right, in its own format of line breaks and unique patterns, right, is excessive, and so represents uh, Krafchenko's life uh,
Hmm.
more than any history ever could, right? And that's why I think there is something to do with this artistically, but I don't know what else it is. Like I think this particular medium was perfect, right, uh, for Cooley in this case, because you can kind of play with it. Maybe a painting, right, or an animated short perhaps, but like I feel like the excess of it and the way that language is its own character that
Hmm.
builds Krafchenko, I think it works so well. Um, so I can't necessarily think of a better way to adapt it. I think you're right on that front.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's just not a lot of ways to use it.
So ultimately, what do you make of the Canadian Wild West? Is it still subpar to the American Wild West?
Oh, 100%. Yes, always will be.
We'll never have our Deadwood.
I don't think we should be trying to. We should be trying to
No,
do our own thing.
that's fine. We will come back to this topic though, because I do actually want to talk about um, that other James Gray book that I was mentioning before, The Red
Hmm.
Lights on the Prairies. So prostitution and sex work that was developing on the prairies, which I think is a fascinating topic and kind of goes against what the moral assumptions of the time were of the prairies. And that's
Hmm.
part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this story as well, is because it kind of is not something that we hear a lot about. Um, we kind of imagine the prairies as mind-numbingly boring as a place of settlement, and yet it wasn't. Um, okay. Anything
All
else to add, or
right.
shall we call it there?
I think I'm good. I think that's it for me.
All right.
Amazing.
Do you want to take us away?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to another wonderful episode of Historia Canadiana. You can reach out with any questions, comments, or concerns through our Facebook page and by email. You can support the show through PayPal as a pay what you feel the show is worth, or you can use our affiliate links in the recommended reading page we have set up. You can find perks like extra ad-free episodes on Patreon, but as always, this is optional, and the show will continue to remain free on Spotify, but now maybe with some possible sponsorship. So, all that aside, this show will continue to be what it is. Finally, if you could leave a review on iTunes and share it with some friends, it would be greatly appreciated. It helps to boost the show, get into more people's ears. We'll see you here next time on Historia Canadiana, where we talk about the Great White North myth of the invincible Bear McDougal. Have a nice day, everybody. Cheers.
Cheers.